colleagues, distinguished colleagues, distinguished representatives of the Jewish community, my dear friends, this occasion which prompts us to come together is focused about the vivid personality of a great man whose untimely and tragic passing was lamented by world Jewry and singularly by Medinat Yisrael, and I could say American and Canadian Jewry and English Jewry, as singularly as the Jewish community of Medinat Yisrael. Someone may properly ask that we are concerning ourselves with this memorial in the midst of the celebration by the young Israel of Montreal of its 50th anniversary, its Yovel, its Jubilee. Is this not a paradox which conflicts with our sensitivities, with our emotions? And yet, the psalmist, Jewish history, the halacha has taught us in the words of David HaMelech, A'aleh es Yerushalayim al Rosh Simchosi. But on the contrary, in the moments of transcendent joy, in the moments of true exaltation, we have been told to bring up the remembrance of Yerushalayim. Perhaps today, with the reality of the rebuilding, of the reconstruction of a Yerushalayim Hashleima, of a Medinat Yisrael, this remembrance does not connotate lamentation or sorrow, but rather joy and festivity. Nevertheless, the rabbinic reference to A'aleh es Yerushalayim al Rosh Simchosi implies the anguish and the sorrow, the pain and the travail that relate to the fact of Yerushalayim in the history of our people. If the city of Yerushalayim itself cannot evoke the sentiments of sorrow and anguish today, Baruch Hashem, the remembrance of Yerushalayim, as we come to recognize the fact that Yerushalayim had suffered a great loss, has sustained a grievous loss in the passing of Rabbi Ya'akov David bar Rav Yitzchok Isaac Halevi Hertzog, who was known throughout Canada and the United States and throughout the diplomatic world as Dr. Ya'akov Hertzog, Zechrono Livrocha. It is not for me to portray for you the meaningfulness of his personality, although personally my association with Dr. Hertzog Zal was of great significance to me in the years that I spent in Washington, and when I have come to learn to respect him and revere him and admire him and cherish his association from the very first moments that he set foot in my congregation in Washington on the night of nights in the Jewish tradition, on Yom Kippur, on Kol Nidrei night. And his coming into the synagogue at that time was truly a Kiddush Hashem, because it was his presence and his influence that contributed to sustaining a congregation within the ranks of orthodoxy, despite the turmoil and the conflicts that took place in the question of what kind of a synagogue to establish. This is, of course, the least significant fact of his person. And this is probably the smallest contribution that he made. For indeed, he was the Ne'er Yisrael. He was the light of Israel, the man of great wisdom and knowledge. He was, in the words of our Talmud, the Amud Hayemini, that pillar, that right pillar, the righteous pillar, the man who had the courage to stand up to the Goliaths and to the Sar Shel Esav, and stand up with such great success, stand up without concern against an enemy, a subtle enemy, an enemy that did not come with spears, but an enemy that nevertheless came to do harm, irreparable harm, to Klal Yisrael and particularly to Medinas Yisrael. This Amud Hayemini, this righteous pillar, was a Patish HaChozok. He was a strong hammer who had overwhelming strength and power to be able to fight the battles, the Milchemes Hashem, diplomatically, intellectually, with great fulfillment, and most particularly, L'Kadesh Shem Shamayim. Here was the giant Goliath that came to fight Yaakov David Hertzog. Yaakov, who wrestled, as the Torah tells us, with the Sar Shel Esav, and David, who fought Goliath. And nevertheless, he was able to overcome this great adversary as you in Montreal so well know, for this was one of the glorious chapters in the history of Judaism on the Canadian scene, and most certainly will be enshrined and inscribed as one of the great moments, I may say, in the history of these disputations that take us back to the terrible periods of confrontations that Klal Yisrael had to face. And it was by the grace of God that we were able to find these champions. The champions like the Ramban, the champions like Rabbi Ya'akov David Hertzog Zal, who stood up fully armed and armored with the knowledge of Torah, with the commitment with Torah, with the self-sacrifice that is required of heroic personalities, and come out victorious and come out in such a fashion that we all felt that indeed the name of Israel and the name of Elokei Yisrael was exalted. It is therefore our responsibility as a small Hakoras Tova to give due regard to the fact and the reality of his life, and at the same time to shed a tear to express the inner sorrow that the soul of Israel, that Klal Yisrael has sustained. This is indeed a difficult task, but nevertheless we were told to ever recall and to ever reflect upon the past, and that hesped which is mentioned in the Talmud is Yekora Dechayev. It is for the uplifting of the living. It is for the necessity of bringing deeper awareness and deeper consciousness into our lives to understand, first of all, the meaning of Torah. What Torah means in the transformation of the individual, which was indeed the very life, the very root from which Dr. Hertzog Zal sprung from. He was raised in Torah, he lived in Torah, and he was able to fulfill himself in Torah. And the second reality which he manifested under all circumstances was the reality of Medinas Yisrael. He was that stalwart man who was entrusted with the most delicate diplomatic missions that were successfully concluded to such an extent that never was he truly given this accolade, this special recognition that was due to him. And the third fact was his understanding and awareness of Klal Yisrael. So if he came to Washington, he was not only an emissary of Medinas Yisrael for a singular purpose, he was also an emissary to Klal Yisrael, bringing forth the meaningfulness of Achdus Yisrael, which is indeed the essential fact of our existence. There is a Yerushalmi in Pesachim which states, Shlosha henichu kisreihem be'olam hazeh ve'yorshu olam habo. There were three who are mentioned who gave up their crowns in this world and were able to achieve a crown, the greatest of crowns in the world to come. And indeed, as you may have read some of the obituaries, some of the hespedim which were expressed concerning Rabbi Yaakov David Hertzog, Zechrono Levrocha, you may recognize the fact that he never wore a crown. He never really achieved that recognition and that attention and that special status that he certainly deserved to have. And it was indeed within the character of this rabbinic postulate that he was amongst those who gave up their crowns b'olam hazeh. He never sought special honor. He never sought special recognition. But in the fullness and the richness of his accomplishment, he was able to find the greatest fulfillment. This is indeed the measure of this great personality, of whom young Israel of Montreal and Canadian Jewry in particular has reason to remember and to revere, and most of all to recognize as that Ne'er Yisrael, that light, that inspiration that can guide us and direct us to a total awareness, to a total consciousness as to what we must respond to in these challenging and overwhelming times. This is the essential message of the life of this great man. And if we can send forth sentiments and feelings, I know that there are the hearts of many who have expressed silently and deeply their feelings to his dear family, to his dear wife and children, to his beloved mother. To all the members of the family we send our consolation, we send our word of comfort with the tefillah that this great achievement that was his life indeed will lighten their days and drive out the darkness which has so overwhelmed them, and that the Ne'er Yisrael, that this light will continue to flourish within us as we continue to devote our concerns and our dedications to those things and those ideals which are Torah, Klal Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, that these things will have greater meaning to us and that we will respond with greater concern. And then indeed will his life continue to be bound up in the bond of the living, in the bond of those who truly deserve the Keser Shel Olam Habo. Amen. It is my privilege now for a few words of tribute on behalf of the rabbinate, we could say on behalf of the Canadian rabbinate as well as the rabbinate of Montreal, the great scholar, the great Talmudist, the chief rabbi of Montreal, Harav HaGoen Rav Pinchas Hirschbruch.
Die Afge Hushi Vegast Horav Jakobowitsch wir sind zusammengekommen abgeben dem letzten Kobet, weil der Gemure sucht, ein maßbezahler Mensch ist du a Schaas Chimim. Schaas Chimim drückt sich aus der Gemure 30 Tag, oder die Gemure drückt sich aus efter ein Jahr hochet, sucht die Gemure Schane Rabunen, kivende Kolschate, Matgerisch Mataye, Geschaas Chimim Dumme. Wenn Tau mit Hochem geht weg von der Welt, ist also wie mit viel Zeit der Verlust, ist es Schaas Chimim. Ich habe gehabt die Gelegenheit, kennenzulernen, dem Nifte Jakob David Herzig, ein Lehrer von 10 Jahren. Ich habe ihn gesehen, der Mensch, der größte Talmud Chochem, auf ihm kann man sagen, muss der Chazal sagen. Rabavie ki have use memesifte bei Käse. Der Chazal drückt sich aus auf einen von der Meruhen. Rabavie ki have use, wenn ist gekommen memesifte von der Yeshiva bei Käse. Es sind zwei Personen darin. Eine, a politischen, a Kurve von Malches, und bei eine ist mit mir Sifte, a Talmud Chochem, a Gudo, aber es soll sich beide vereinigen in ein Mensch, ist sehr schwer. Das ist gewähr Rabavie, ki have use mit mir Sifte, finde mir Sifte, sei gekimme, lebei Käse. Hat gehabt Zeit, aufzugehen, zu teure, lebei Käse. Und das ist sehr interessant, ist geheißen, Rabbi Ya'akov David. Die Gemure sucht Rab Maya Budik Bishmu, dem Numen. Bei David HaMelech gefunden wir sehr interessante Sache. War nicht verlose lechu Hashem Eisrutsen. David HaMelech trägt sich aus, ich bete dir rebäunische Leulem Eisrutsen. Azad, wo ist der Tag Eisrutsen? Suchen der Chazal im Bruches, klärt in dem Schatz von dem Eisrutsen. Noch man kann öfter klären, David HaMelech ist gewesen ein vielseitiger Mensch. Heute ist er gewesen, wie der Chazal drückt sich aus, le David Shomro Nafshi Kechusetani, sagt die Gemure, loi Chusetani, shekol Malche Mizrach Marev, Ishaine Matschule Schuhes, van ich hat so Islale ukem Leudesloch. David HaMelech gewesen ein Mensch, was ganze Tage Nacht hat gearbeitet. Wie noch ein Richter Juda Melech Luches Bedam Bishapie Bishalje. Hat gepasst Charles. David HaMelech ist gewähnt der Rosh HaSanhedrin. David HaMelech ist gewähnt, was hat geführte Melchumes. Zu ihm sind gekommen Ambassadoren. Und David HaMelech gesagt, Rabbeinu Shalom, ich bete. Wenn ich gelob ma schwere Schale, a schwere den Teure, a schweres der Pakte, so mach nicht demut, will ich bedarfen konzentrieren, ma Meinung in Teure, so man nicht kommen mit Badern mit Politik, so man nicht kommen Badern der Melech Amen, sind ein anderer Melech. Ich bete von nicht für Luselig Hashem, Eisrutzen. Ich bete, so es begeht bei allem mein Zeit. A demut, wenn ich gib mir Chuppe teure, soll ich Chuppen machen, Koppe sind teure, ich soll nicht kennen, mir sind keine andere Sachen demut. Jakob Herzig gewähnt dasselbe. Ein Mensch, was gewähnt, dem Siftele bei Käse, ein Mensch, was hat gearbeitet, so viel, regt sie alle Medien, sie sind gelaufen, wie man bedarf, hat man mitgenommen, Jakob Herzig, aber Jakob Herzig gewähnt, der Kawaii, item und teure, wen komm ich mit ihm getroffen, hat er mir nur gesagt, ach, ich muss von Bechadisch gewinnen lernen. Als ein Mensch wie Jakob Herzig ist ein Karam Ziel. Als ein Mensch mit einem Kopf, mit einem genialen Kopf, als geht er weg von der Welt, in der besten Jugend ist für uns einer von den größten Verlusten. Schane Rabunen, kivende Cholschate, Matkerisch Mataye, Kishaf Chemendummen. Es dachte sich ins Ort jetzt. Jakob Herzig weggegangen, fehlt ihn. Soll der Nifte sein, am Meilitz Joische, also wird es gewähnt du, a Schliach Zibbe, von dem jüdischen Volk, soll sein in Himmel, am Meilitz Joische, so schon sagen, Schulem al Yisruel, in Medinas Yisruel soll herrschen Schulen, im soll solche sein, zu der ämmerstike jüdische Yeshia, Willa Hamuves Leneizach, Emuch Hashem, Dimum al Papunem, in solche sein, wie es Mashiach, das keine Human.
As a measure of the great and varied stature of the late and lamented former ambassador of Israel to Canada, it is my privilege now to introduce a distinguished national leader of Canadian Jewry, who is certainly a most appropriate spokesman for the Jewish community of Canada by his past performance as national president. I am privileged now to call upon Mr. Monroe Abbey, QC.
Ladies and gentlemen, the death of Ya'akov Herzog is an immeasurable blow to the intellectual and moral existence of Klal Yisrael. He personified those rare qualities which, when found in one human being, amount to greatness. Ya'akov Herzog was deeply rooted in two great traditions. He was Jewish to the very marrow of his bones. There was a massive commitment to erudition, wedded to a sense of Kabbalistic mysticism, which enriched his preoccupation with Jewish destiny. He was one of the very few Jews of the world stature, seized with the mystical relevance of 5 millennia of history. He had been completely aware of the harsh realpolitik in which Israel and the Jewish people survived. He was immersed in a profound engagement to his people with a constant but urgent emphasis where the past and present merged as the crossroad of our future. Ya'akov Herzog was one of a handful of Jewish leaders one could listen to time and time again with the keenest anticipation, for he played the music rather than just the notes. He was admired no less by ordinary men and women than by great leaders with whom he met. We recall with infinite sadness his appearance at our last plenary assembly, where he manifested the capacity to touch again the very wellspring of the Jewish soul. His interest in Canadian Jewish Congress was such that during several discussions with him in Jerusalem, he suggested that a monograph be written of our activities for use by other communities throughout the diaspora. His warm association over many years caused him to fulfill a promise to address our triennial assembly, even though at that time he was ill. He was by temperament reasonable and empirical. His fine intellect made him distrustful of political ideologies. He shunned glitter, but was also understanding of those who needed it. Perhaps he was one of the few people who was as much at home in an Oxford common room as in the Steibel. The Canadian Jewish community is fortunate that he spent 3 years in our midst as Israel ambassador to Canada. And it was while in Canada, busy as he was, that he completed his doctorate in law at the University of Ottawa. This great statesman and untimely death, we bow our heads in deep reverence in tribute to this sweet and gentle man, whose memory will serve as an inspiration for many years to come. We join in this tribute, which the Young Israel of Montreal arranged as part of its 50th anniversary activities. And we welcome to our city the eminent Chief Rabbi, Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz, who tonight will deliver a memorial lecture which is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Ya'akov Herzog, a learned doctor of laws, a most worthy rabbi, very
Distinguished leaders of the community and of this congregation, and friends all. Such are the vagaries and ironies of life that in response to the most cordial invitation extended to me by my friend Rabbi Kaufman to be your guest here this evening, I am charged to, as it were, recite two contradictory blessings at the same time. To say on the one hand, Baruch Atov HaMeitiv, at the happy and cheerful tiding of your reaching your Jubilee anniversary, and to rejoice with you in your having now started the second 50-year cycle in your existence, and at the same time also to recite Baruch Dayan Emes, stricken with utter grief over one who, alas, just as he had entered the second 50-year cycle of his life, breathed it out. Let me perhaps at the outset, and especially in acknowledging the very gracious and warm welcome extended to me by a friend whose cordiality and kindliness I have treasured ever since those unforgettable moments when, as a visitor from Ireland, he received me in Washington and indeed introduced me into the White House. Let me, in response to him, and his reference to this being my first visit in my present office to your community, reassure you right away in, as it were, presenting my credentials that I am not here in order to assert the identity of the words British Commonwealth in my title and in your Constitution. If anything, what may perhaps, in one sense at any rate, bring me closer to the great memory to whom this lecture tonight is being dedicated than perhaps anyone else, it is the fact that I was privileged twice to succeed into a rabbinical office vacated by a Hertzog. It was my honor to be the successor of the late sainted Chief Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi Herzog upon his leaving Dublin to take up the position of Chief Rabbi of the Holy Land. When I assumed that office in
1949, and it was under rather different and very much more distressing conditions. Once again, my lot to assume the office to which Ya'akov Herzog had been elected, and which, alas, for reasons of ill health that then already plagued him, he had to vacate before he could assume it, thus once again creating a vacancy which eventually I was called upon to fill. And it was not only this double relationship to father and son that made me live for 10 years in a home where physically Ya'akov Herzog was raised from childhood, the Herzog home in Dublin, and that by a strange coincidence made me live prior to that in my then last position in London in the home occupied for many years by his grandfather, Diane Hillman, in the East End of London, when I was later minister of the great synagogue there. It was already in our student days that Ya'akov Herzog and myself attended the same yeshiva for a while in London at Eitz Chaim, and that not only a friendship, but a sense of bond and comradeship between us was forged that held out to virtually the last day of his life of constant contacts with him, and that indeed survived his passing and is an inextricable part of myself and of whatever I am. Having in recent weeks visited the home of Rabbanit Herzog, the shattered and grief-stricken mother, as well as the home of Penina, his wife, and the children, bereaved, widowed, and orphaned, and seen the emptiness, the utter emptiness that surrounds them, one perhaps began to sense a measure of the emptiness that has indeed overtaken Jewish life at large, and certainly in communities where Yaakov was so well known, such as your community here in Canada, and I know how very much he, and as since confirmed by his wife, always looked upon this precious 3-year stay here as perhaps the highlight and the glory, at least the public glory, of his official career. How empty our life has become, our Jewish community has become, and Klal Yisrael has become, through the departure of quite an extraordinary personality whose imprint on our destiny as Jews, and above all in resurgent Israel, may only in the course of time become ever more fully apparent. May I, in these few introductory words of tribute to him, merely say one thing. I believe he represented more than any other Jewish individual in our generation the ancient classic ideal of the rabbi, philosopher, statesman, exemplified, as Rabbi Kaufman pointed out, by sages like the Ramban, or perhaps like the Abarbanel, and hardly found in our generation at all. Perhaps I might say more, it is one of the most, certainly to those that still have a spark of Jewish feeling and attachment, it is one of the most agonizing experiences that often overcomes us, that when we hear political representatives, ministers, agents of the government and state of Israel speak in public, that the arguments they use, the whole reasoning, the whole process of thought, just as well be used by some minister or some ambassador of Uganda or of any other country. And that you could just substitute the word Israel for another land, and you get precisely the same argumentation, the same presentation, the same reasoning in defense of its policies. If there was one man who in his understanding of even the most direct and immediate political considerations respecting the state of Israel and its security was governed entirely by the uniqueness of Jewish thought, by the incomparable grandeur and majesty of Israel as part of a process of revelation that had its origin with our patriarchs, with Matan Torah at Sinai, and that will have its destiny and fulfillment in the realization of the Messianic age. If there was one who in his whole understanding of the cataclysmic events of our time would use exclusively Jewish categories and would present to those whom he always so much excited and stirred in his brilliant and profound addresses, the panorama of the exciting events of our time in terms that could only be comprehended as part of the unfolding of Jewish history, then it was Ya'akov Herzog who somehow had a knack for appreciating the Jewishness of the significance of the events through which we have moved, and who even when giving statesmanlike political advice or when analyzing a purely political situation would use terms of reference and insights that were drawn from the depths of his Jewish commitment and of his enormous, exclusively and specifically Jewish perspicacity. In former days, in biblical days, and I want to say this to lead on to my subject proper, Jewish leadership was divided between the Melech, the king, the man of power and authority, those who made the decisions, those who entered into treaties, those who fashioned the immediate fabric of the state and its institutions on the one hand, and the Novi, the prophet, the man who held no position, the man who wielded no power and no authority, and indeed who was in his own day often derided and ignored, pushed into the background, and in comparison with all the paraphernalia of statehood and majesty and pomp and power, looked puny and insignificant. But with the advantage of hindsight drawn from the experience of history, how has the situation reversed itself? How insignificant and hardly relevant are the contributions, the idiosyncrasies, the particular policies adopted by this or that king of Israel, many of whose names we hardly recall or remember, as against the immortality, the might, the sweeping influence over the ages of prophets who in their day did not matter and were not part of the pattern of society, and who only in the course of time began to prevail, to triumph, and who still to this day, 2,000 or 3,000 years later, inspire our thinking, our ideals, our solution to moral and ethical problems, and our ultimate ambitions in the forward march both of Israel and of mankind. One wonders, when the stirring history of our own time is going to be written, who will eventually be the ones that will be looked on and looked upon as having played a cardinal role in shaping our destinies? Those who have happened to have held power in our time, who have occupied great and important offices, whose names inspired awe and reverence and respect and honor, or those who were benister, who were in their own day responsible only for the thinking process, for the ideas, for the long-term mapping out, who didn't make the decisions, who didn't wield any authority, but who perhaps with eyes of prophecy, of insight and inspiration, were able to see further, beyond the problems of today, and project an ultimate fulfillment that the wielders of power couldn't see, and that only the Novi, the prophet, unrecognized in his own time, and yet immortal in the overall judgment of history, was able to assess. Let me conclude this part by a reference to the Sidra, Vahi b'yom kalos Moshe lehokim es hamishkan, and it was when Moses completed to set up the first temple to the glory of God ever built on earth, the tabernacle in the wilderness. Says Rashi, Vahi b'yom kalos Moshe Betzalel v'Oholiov v'chol chacham leif also as a mishkan. The architects, the builders of this tabernacle, it wasn't Moses, it was Betzalel, it was Oholiov, and was all others who lent a hand. They were the ones that wielded the instruments, that drew up the plans, that made the decisions, both on the drawing board and ultimately in the carrying out of its designs. Why does it say Vahi b'yom kalos Moshe? Why are not the builders named? V'teloah hakosov b'Moshe lefi shemosa nafsha olav liros tavnis kol dova v'dova kemo sheheror b'hor. Because Moses, he was ready to surrender his life in order to ensure that every detail and every particular in this great building, this the first monument to the service of God ever built on earth, holy privilege, a few months back to spend 3 days in Vienna and face and be a personal witness to one of the most momentous experiences that anyone can ever hope to have in a lifetime, in being able to greet this beginning of the stream that we hope will develop into a flood of Jews from the Soviet Union as they come out and arrive at the station there in their train from Moscow on their way to Eretz Israel under conditions that beg a description in the exhilaration of this reunion between brethren that we witnessed. Having then frequent occasions to see the face of Jewish life and what stirs today in Jewish communities the world over, one also feels as if we have, wherever you go today, to recite a dual blessing, this double blessing, or shall we say this mixed blessing, at one and the same time. On the one hand, alas, there is ample reason for saying in many places, if not in all, Bo Dynamis, for the catastrophic losses that we continue to suffer, even in our free communities, through desertion, through defection, through intermarriage, losses on a colossal scale, running now into numbers that may be comparable to the inroads made in the Nazi Holocaust on our total numbers, running into millions that we're losing. And losing among our youth, among young people who couldn't care less, not about our communities, not about Israel, not about Judaism, not about learning, not even about the human values that used to distinguish Jewish life and family life. And alas, as we see this fearful process of disintegration and drift, how ample is our reason to recite over and over again in utter grief and anguish, Bo Dynamis, merely according in utter perplexity to God the acknowledgement that He is a righteous judge, even if we can't comprehend why a catastrophe on such dimensions should befall us after the bloodletting through which we had already gone in the last generation. And yet at the very same time, as you say, Bo Dynamis, in all these communities, and see a massive flight from Judaism, Baruch Hashem, perhaps we have even more reason to recite with a heart overfilled with joy and gratitude, Baruch Hatov HaMeitiv, for the massive return and the rebuilding and the regeneration and rebirth of Jewish values, of Torah learning, of great institutions, of schools, of yeshivot, that has gone on a spectacular scale, all over the Jewish world during this post-war period, as far away as Melbourne, of Vienna, Welt, with a community perhaps, a third of your size or less. They have got there today the largest Jewish day school in the world, with 2,100 Talmidim Kein Yirbu, plus 6 other day schools, which has suddenly given new life, a new lease of life, to a community that was convinced a few years ago it was doomed and finished, and that now has embarked on a new process of revitalization and regeneration. And similarly, wherever you go today, and I've had the joy of seeing it here in this country, having only recently been as far away as San Francisco, which was a city where Torah was hardly at home. And Baruch Hashem, a flourishing day school is there now. And down south in New Orleans, in March, was there, celebrating the first anniversary of that new school. What new lease of life, flourishing life, vibrant life, has been brought back to communities that appeared blighted. Baruch Hatov HaMeitiv, that we live in a generation where this is true. Look at Russian Jewry. How we can recite both Dai and Emes 3 million times for what was once the most creative Jewish community in the world, where virtually all our scholars came from, all our great Gaonim, our great institutions, the greatest Jewish movements of our time, the Hasidic movements, the Zionist movement. Everything was spawned and born, bred out of this once great, dynamic Jewish community. And now, alas, it's prostrate. No shuls, no schools, no Rabbonim, cut off from the rest of our community, but a little shadow of its former self, and groaning under the yoke of a repression, cruel, utterly dementing and debilitating, and sentenced to a process of spiritual attrition, the like of which has never before been seen by any Jewish community at any time of our history. And yet, as we cry and weep and wail over their misfortune and the misfortune that has struck our people, and exclaim with a bitter heart, Baruch Dein Emes, what a miracle is taking place there! Of suddenly, out of nowhere, miracle of miracles, a resurgence, a new quest for Jewish values, Jewish identity. Baruch Hatov HaMeitiv, I couldn't begin to describe to you what quality of olim, of immigrants, are now coming out from Soviet Russia, whom I met there in Vienna. What caliber of people! What Mesiras Nefesh! What Kiddush Hashem! I met a young man there, coming off the train from Riga, introduced me to his little daughter in impeccable Yiddish that he spoke, and says her name is Dakara. We asked him, what name is Dakara? I never heard this name. And he explained, my child was born at the time when Israel lost the submarine called Dakar. And I did not want for a single day to forget the sacrifice that the defenders of Israel had brought, so that I may one day, together with my family, go back to my homeland and be reunited with my people. And I gave my daughter the name Dakara after this sacrifice of so many valiant defenders of our land and of our newly won independence. It didn't occur to us in the free world. And there, under that repression, where you cannot openly demonstrate your Zionist sympathies, there it occurred to them. I spoke only the day before yesterday again, on the telephone, to a professor in Riga, a man so eminent in his particular department,